Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to Elite Medical Prep's webinar this evening on how to make the most of dedicated and prepare for USMLE Step 1. We're waiting, we'll probably wait one more minute and the webinar will kick off. And just to remind all of you who've joined already, this webinar will be recorded and it will be available for you to watch back if you want to or share with your friends on our website. The link to it will be posted in this presentation. And then as well, you email with the link to the recording following the presentation this evening. And you'll also receive a link to the Step 1 calendars that we've prepared for you all to access as well. And then lastly, please make sure to put any questions for the Q&A portion in our Q&A at the bottom of your screen for the Zoom webinar so that we can get to those questions when we get to the Q&A portion. So for those of you who just joined, thanks so much for coming. This is the webinar on how to make the most of dedicated and prepare for USMLE Step 1. I'm Emily Zielinski, and I'm joined here by Alina Khil, who's one of our other tutors at Elite Medical Prep, and we'll go ahead and jump right in.
Hi, everyone. I'm Alina.
Do you want to share any background on your...
I do. Thank you. Hi, I'm a general surgery resident in California. I've been with EMP for almost 2 years now and excited to get started today.
Awesome. And like I said, my name's Emily Zielinski. I'm currently a 5th-year orthopedic surgery resident at Indiana University in the state of Indiana, and I will be doing a spine surgery fellowship next year at Cleveland Clinic. I'm really excited to be here with you guys. I've been at Elite Medical Prep for about 4.5 years now, working on prepping everyone from USMLE exams to residency advising. And so really excited to be here with you guys tonight. All right, so we'll jump right in. So just as a quick reminder for those of you who are new to Elite Medical Prep, Elite Medical Prep is a leader in personalized tutoring for medical school exams. Our organization offers tutoring via longstanding partnerships with medical schools around the world and also on an individualized one-on-one basis and also with small group tutoring as well. So we offer tutoring services for all USMLE STEP exams, as well as COMLEX exams, shelf exams, NBMEs, residency advising, residency matching, mock interviews. Also, we're doing MCAT tutoring as well, and then medical admissions advising too. So we really run the gamut. And if you need help with any of that, we'll have some information at the end of this slide or at the end of this slide deck for how to reach out and get a hold of us. Okay, so jumping into the real meat of this presentation, how are you going to succeed and make the most of your dedicated to do well on Step 1? Obviously, Step 1 is now pass-fail exam, which, thankfully you're not the first group of people to be going through that. But I think the key components of any successful Step 1 study program are these 4 things. 1, you need time. You need to have enough time available in your schedule to really dedicate yourself to studying for this exam. It's a little bit like drinking. I mean, medical school in general, I guess, is a little bit like drinking from a fire hose in that there's just so much information coming at you at a high pace and a high volume. And it takes a lot of time to put all of that information in your brain and build the connections amongst the material that will allow you to find success when you're tackling questions during your USMLE exam. So you need an appropriate amount of time. We'll get into just how much time on the next slide. But the other key component to achieving success on Step 1 is using high yield resources. And you need to make sure that you're not using too many resources. So we'll get into that as well. But you really want to make sure that you're dedicating your study efforts to using the resources that are kind of tried and true, proven resources to help you succeed and memorize the material that you need to memorize, and also understand the key concepts that will allow you to be successful when you're approaching all of these vignettes that sometimes get really long and really lengthy and hard to dissect through. The other key component is going to be practice exams. Practice exams are so critical, not only for assessing how ready you are for taking the exam, but also just as another source of additional questions for you to use in your preparation. And then the other piece is a really good study calendar. And more than just having a study calendar, it's important to stick to a study calendar. So we'll get into that too and how you build a study calendar.
All right, so the average dedicated period for students for Step 1 is 6 weeks. Usually schools give students about 6 to 8 weeks to prepare. Always important to start off with the practice exam before you start studying to see your baseline. And not only to see your baseline, but to also see what your weaknesses are. You may score higher in some areas and lower in some areas, and then you can really tailor your study schedule to make sure that you start off hitting those weaker areas that you did not score as well in. And as it says here, one size does not fit all. So a study plan or a study strategy that may work for one student, that may work for your classmate, may not work for you. We all learn differently and we all study differently. And we also all have different weaknesses. You know, somebody may know cardio well, and, you know, maybe for you, cardio may be very difficult. So really plan around that, and don't kind of really try to imitate what some other person is doing, but really see what works best for you instead. During the study period, you should be studying at least 8 hours daily, ideally 10 to 12 hours. Take one day off a week just to make sure that you're preventing burnout. And yeah, these will seem like long hours. I realize that, and you know, I'm not saying it's going to be easy, but you really have to mentally prepare yourself to be studying for these long periods of time. The other thing that you're doing as you're studying for this long is preparing yourself for the endurance of an 8-hour long exam that the step 1 will be.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the other key to think about too is 6 weeks might be the average, but some students do require more time.
Mm-hmm.
And so you might want to, based on your practice exam at the beginning of your study block, you might want to get an idea of, you know, how close you are to being prepared to sit for the exam. If you're not within kind of like a 50% even likelihood of passing step 1 based on your first practice exam, or something even like a little bit higher at 70%, you might want to consider how you can adjust your schedule to allow you to extend your dedicated period. So some programs do allow you to take a vacation month, for example, right at the beginning of your 3rd year or right at the end of your 3rd year, depending on when your school has you take step 1, so that you can elongate your study period to be 10 weeks. And you'll see with our next, towards the end of this presentation, we have both a 5-week and a 10-week study calendar that will be options for you in any event. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. It is really important. And also some sections that are more heavier, like biochem, may take you a longer time to study. So that's also, if that is a section that you're scoring lower in, you know, you really have to really account for that study time there as well. In terms of resources, there are so many different resources, as you already know, so many options. But it is going to be better to actually know a few resources in depth rather than knowing some of many different resources. So we do want to encourage you to limit to 3 to 4 resources. And it's very important to pick the resources that work best for you. One of your resources and your main resource should be a question bank. Don't attempt to do multiple question banks all at once. Pick one question bank that works for you. There's options of UWorld, AMBOSS. You can always try before your dedicated period, you can always try and see which one is working better for you, or maybe you know which one has been working better for you during your 1st and 2nd year of medical school. And then there's a lot of different resources with video lectures, same thing, choose, you know, for these, choose 1 or 2 and stick to those. In terms of textbooks, you probably already know first aid. In terms of how to use first aid, so I know many of you probably have heard, if you just memorize first aid, you're going to be good. It's a common misconception. I mean, yes, if you know everything in first aid, that would be amazing. But it's not just about memorizing. It's actually also about understanding what is in there. And first aid, as you know, it has a lot of high yield points. It doesn't really have explanations for those high yield points. And that's where your questions come in, and that's where your video lectures come in to fill in those gaps. So always cross-reference with first aid and use first aid as a guide to tell you, okay, this is what I need to be studying about this particular topic. But don't rely on it as in terms of, you know, if I just memorize all of it, you know, I'm going to do well. Really, questions are going to be your best way to practice, because that's what you're going to see on exam. And then in terms of spaced repetition, You've probably already heard of Anki, but very important to be doing spaced repetition. This especially applies to your incorrects. So if you see that you missed a topic on a question, you don't understand it, this is when you really want to dive deeper into that topic and make sure that you use spaced repetition to retain that topic. So putting that topic on an Anki card or a UWorld flashcard, or even a written card if you prefer to write your cards out. But really not just making the card, but also making sure that you're reviewing the card too. The process of making the card itself will help you retain a lot of information, but you still need that spaced repetition to make sure that you're not forgetting it. And this is very, very important for the topics that you're missing and the topics that you're getting wrong in questions. And then you can always, make cards for anything that you feel like you tend to forget, or, maybe you got it right, but you weren't really sure about it. Those are also things to address in your cards. And then in terms of what exactly you should be studying or how exactly you should be studying. So there's a really nice pyramid here. I really, really like this picture. And it's all about active learning versus passive learning. And as you can see at the bottom of the pyramid, we have things that are active learning. And as we go towards the top of the pyramid, we have things that are less active. As you move towards the top of the pyramid, the retention level, how much information you are retaining from that study method goes down and down and down further. So in other words, if you're doing practice questions and reviewing them, this is the most active way to study. You are going to be retaining a lot of that knowledge versus if you're simply just reading through first aid, it's very unlikely that you're going to retain a lot of that information. So you really want to focus your time on active studying. And I know it's going to be more painful. It's very nice and easy to kind of sit there and look through a book, and convince yourself that you know this stuff. But it's so much harder when you actually have to put your knowledge to the test and think through the questions and answer the question and figure out why you got it wrong. And then, or even flashcards, when you're doing Anki flashcards, you're literally quizzing yourself. You're figuring out what are the things that I still don't know. So really putting that knowledge to the test will not only help you identify what gaps in knowledge you have and what you need to be studying, but it will also help you retain as much of the information as possible. In fact, if you're doing more active studying, you're going to need less hours of studying than if you were to just be doing passive studying. So try to lean more, most of your study time really should be spent on questions. It should be spent on review. Some of the time should be spent on doing Anki flashcards, making sure, or any other type of flashcards, making sure that you're doing spaced repetition. And videos, reading, visual memory aids, those things are great to really kind of fill in those gaps that you're seeing yourself, maybe any topics that you're missing in questions. That would be a good time to go and see, okay, is there a video about this topic that I can watch to further clarify? And then when you're actually relating that information, that video to the question, that's even better, right? That's even more active learning for you because now you're trying to apply what you learned in that video and figure out why did you miss this question. All right, and then in terms of practice exams, so I know we already said at the very beginning, you want to take one practice exam, establish a baseline, and see what your weaknesses are. Throughout your studying, you should be taking a practice exam every 1 to 2 weeks. Maybe at the start, you can give it a couple of weeks, but as you're getting closer and closer to the test, I would definitely be taking a practice exam every week. And this is very important. A lot of students take practice exams and, don't review them or, look back on them maybe 3 weeks later. You want to review the practice exam after you finish it. And you really want to use these questions to figure out what is it I don't know? What is it I need to be studying more? And you can use the score report too, things that you may be scored weaker in. Okay, this is the section that I need to be studying. And it can feel really nice to study the things that we know, right? Study the things we're doing well on practice exams, but let's face it, that's not going to help you. What's going to help you is actually studying things that you don't know. So those exams can be really, really crucial in helping you determine those knowledge gaps. And you want, up until kind of exam day, you want to take at the very least 3 practice exams. That's including your one that's a baseline, and then at the very least 2 practice exams before test day. Ideally, I would want to see a student pass at least a couple of NBME exams before I tell them, okay, you know, I feel comfortable with you going and taking step 1. So really use those practice exams to gauge where you are. And if you're doing really great in them, you know, awesome, you know, you probably don't have to push back your exam. So really these can be, these are reliable predictors of how students do on the real exam. All right.
Thanks, Alina, for all of that excellent information. So we kind of talked already about the other 3 key components, right? So you need time, you need high yield resources, and you need practice exams. And the 4th component to an effective and successful step 1 study period is going to be a calendar, and not just a good calendar that keeps you on track, but one that you really stick to. So at EMP, we have developed a couple of different calendar options, both a 5-week calendar option and also a 10-week calendar option. And we're going to kind of briefly walk you through how we set up our calendars that you will have access to. Again, they'll be emailed to you in a link after this webinar, and then you can modify them to your liking. So the key components to a calendar are going to be, first, you need to have a daily question goal. Okay. And typically we're going to be recommending that students are doing around 80 to 120 questions per day during a dedicated period. Additionally, you need to assign days for topical review. So Alina alluded to this a little bit, that, you know, at the beginning of your study calendar or your dedicated period, you'll probably take a baseline practice exam to figure out what your strengths and weaknesses are. And then you can go back and kind of, by setting your test date at the end of your 6-week or 10-week study period, you can then work backwards to figure out how much time you have available to dedicate specific days to reviewing high yield material. So you may want to focus on cardio for 3 days, for example, and then pulm for 3 days. Biochem, maybe, like Alina said, tends to be a challenging subject that you kind of have to go over a few other times and try to memorize some of the key components of the biochem knowledge. So that might be something you want to spend more like 4 days on if you're really struggling with it. But anywho, you will essentially set days for topical review, and then you'll plan your practice exams as well. So you need to make time to take your practice exam and then also review your practice exam, because again, practice exams are not just an opportunity for you to assess where you're at, but also an opportunity for additional questions, which means additional active learning, like Alina already mentioned. And then in addition to those 3 things, you'll want to make sure that you build in catch-up days in your calendar as well. So Alina mentioned that, you know, we recommend taking 1 day off per week of studying so that you can avoid burnout. And that day off can also serve as an opportunity for you to catch up on things if you get behind on your calendar because life gets in the way or something comes up that you can't stick to your calendar as you otherwise were planning to. That way you have these catch-up days so you don't feel flustered like, oh my gosh, I'm never going to get through everything that I planned. And then at the end of your calendar, you want to leave time to go back through your incorrect questions, because like Alina was saying, you know, your incorrect questions tend to be those that you are on concepts or topics that you tend to struggle the most with. And so seeing all of those incorrect questions and that material one more time right before you go into your exam is going to be really critical to being successful. So let's get into the calendar a little bit more in a little bit more detail. So how are you going to build this calendar? Like I said, you want to start first, okay, by setting how much time you're going to have. So we mentioned that we have a 5-week calendar and a 10-week calendar. We made the 5-week calendar because, you know, most schools give you 6 weeks, but sometimes you might not be able to use all 6 weeks. You know, your test date might not be the last exact day of your 6-week period. So 5 weeks gives you a little bit of flexibility to figure out where your test date will fall and kind of work backwards from there and be able to fill the rest of your remaining days and not feel like you're skipping out on anything. The 10-week option is great if you feel like you need a little bit more in-depth review on some subjects. You know, maybe some of your shelf exams haven't been going as well as you would have liked, or you just feel like you've forgotten some things from first year that you really want to buff up on, those types of things. Then, you know, the 10-week option gives you a little bit more time to review content in depth. But ultimately, when you're setting up your calendar, the first thing you want to do is pick your test date. So once you've decided, I'm going to give myself 6 weeks to study, 10 weeks to study, set your test date at the end, and then you're going to work backwards from there. So you notice on this slide here, we have the test date kind of marked out and the rest of the days are blank. And then moving forward from that, or moving backwards, I guess, from that, you want to schedule in your practice exams. So like we said, at least 3 practice exams leading up to test day. And so you'll work backwards from your test day and kind of build in those practice exams. On our calendars that you'll get access to, you'll notice that we have left a practice exam day on a Saturday typically, and then a review day to review your practice exam, kind of go back through the questions, figure out what you missed, what you got right, and kind of review the concepts that might need some buffing up on. And so you'll have a day dedicated to taking a practice exam and a day to review it as well. And then you want to make sure that day 1 is going to be your baseline exam. So once you figure out where your other 2 practice exams will go, in which weekends you would prefer to take them, and then you can kind of go all the way back and say, my first day is going to be my baseline. Okay, and then from there, once you have your practice exams built in, you take the rest of the days available and you break them up by organ system. So like Alina was alluding to before, if there's an area that you really struggle with and you know, like, I really just don't understand like the renal system at all, the nephron confuses me, I need more time on the nephron, you might want to put that, have renal be part of your initial section of kind of 4 days. And you might want to switch up. This is a template of how we broke down our calendar, but based on what your strengths and weaknesses are, you might want to adjust the number of days that you focus on cardio, for example, or the order in which you do them. And that's perfectly okay. And we expect students to do that, again, based on your strengths and your weaknesses. So put key topics up front, and then also put your weaknesses up front, so you make sure that you can really improve those going into test day, and you don't run out of time to focus on your weaknesses. Obviously, like Alina said, I'm totally with you. It's way harder to study things that I know I'm not good at. It's way easier to study the things that I like. And who doesn't like watching Sketchy Micro anyway? That was always a fun thing for me to do. And trying to understand like cardiovascular, physiology and pathophysiology was way less fun. But unfortunately, that is a main key component of step 1. So you want to make sure you put time and effort into preparing for that. Okay. And then once you get to, you've set your practice exams, you've set your kind of topic focus, then you're going to actually break down what you're going to do within each of those assigned topical days. Okay. And so like we said, prioritize active learning first. So the way you start your day, we would always recommend, I tell all my students, start your day with questions. That's when you're most alert in the morning. And it doesn't matter if your morning is 6 a.m. or 10 a.m., if you're more of a night owl versus an early riser, it doesn't matter. But in your morning, whatever time of day it is that you're starting your day, that's where you want to start with your active learning and really put most of your studying focus, because that's when your brain is the most refreshed and most able to really participate in learning. Okay, so you want to start your morning. We have, you'll note here that this box is kind of zoomed in. It says UWorld 80 questions. And as you go through your study calendar, we tend to recommend that you transition from doing the majority of questions on tutor mode early on in your study period to focusing primarily on timed questions. So you'll see in the calendar that it switches from being tutor mode to timed mode as you and you'll gradually wean off of tutor mode into timed mode as the weeks go on. And then, you want to do your questions first, and then you can see here in the afternoon, we have, in the late afternoon, we have review weaker topics. And then in the evenings as well, that's when you can focus on, doing things like watching videos and doing things that are more passive learning, and save like the last hour or 2 before bed to flip through your Anki flashcards or flip through your written flashcards. I personally used like Post-it notes that I put on my wall, and I probably looked like a crazy person. I had all these Post-it notes on my wall when I was studying for step 1, but I would kind of move them from this stack I knew on this side of the wall to like the other side of the wall was where I didn't know them. And so I had to constantly be moving them back and forth, whatever works for you. And ultimately that is the best way for you, and how we find our students have the most success in prepping for step 1 and building their calendar. So Alina, do you have any other comments before we jump into the Q&A?
Yeah, so I remember to also account for breaks, right? Our brains tend to work in like 90-minute to 2-hour blocks. So make sure that you are scheduling those breaks. Otherwise, your brain is going to take a break when it needs it, and then you end up doing poorly in the question set and you feel bad. But yeah, it's very important to take breaks, make sure you're eating, make sure you're taking care of your health, because there are other components to doing well in step one. People think if I just know enough or if I just memorize enough, but you need to be able to endure and get through productively through an 8-hour long test, right? You need to be healthy in order to do that. So please do still take care of your health. Make sure you're still seeing your friends, talking to your family, still having that support system in place. There are all these other things that you also have to make sure that you're doing apart from just studying, so that you stay sane and that you are able to get through the study period and such a long, difficult exam.
Yeah, absolutely. Couldn't agree more. I was actually, I think, in the best shape of my life when I was studying for step one. Remarkably, it was my stress relief. Well, that is most of the content that we have prepared for you guys tonight. We left about 30 minutes for questions. So feel free to write any questions that you have in the chat or in the Q&A rather, so that we can answer whatever questions, and you can get as specific as you want. We're happy to share our time with you guys to help you prepare and be as successful as possible on your upcoming step one exams. While you guys are thinking about any questions that you might have, I'll just throw this kind of slide up for you guys as well, that again, the recording for this webinar will be available online. The link is right there below on the check out our webinars page. And you can also there find information on upcoming webinars, other webinars we'll be hosting that you may want to attend. And one of which is coming up is the COMLEX level 1, how to succeed on COMLEX level 1. So stay on lookout for that webinar, but please ask us whatever questions you guys have that we can answer for you tonight.
Alina and Emily, while we're waiting for people to post questions, could you maybe talk a little bit more about your step one studying experience, what sort of resources you really liked as a student, and just any additional tips you would give everyone in the audience today?
Yeah, absolutely. So my step one studying was actually not as balanced as I would have hoped that it would have been. I did actually neglect my health a lot, which is why I now tell students that it is probably one of the most important things to take care of during your studying. In step two, I turned that around, and it was definitely a much more manageable study period. Nevertheless, resources that I liked, UWorld absolutely was like my go-to. And then using first aid as a guide, as an outline, I would always cross-reference it with my UWorld questions. At the time, I was also annotating first aid. Looking back, I would rather have put those things on Anki cards and reviewed the Anki cards rather than annotating my first aid. I don't think that was as beneficial to me as it could have been having actual cards and reviewing the cards constantly. So I was very much kind of on the side, oh, let me write this down, and let me look over first aid a little more. I think I definitely could have done a little bit more active studying. Nevertheless, it went fine, so that's all right. Sketchy, definitely sketchy. I think everybody likes that, especially sketchy micro was a huge thing for me.
Yeah, absolutely. I would echo what you said. I primarily focused on UWorld as well as a little bit of first aid, and then my crazy sticky note thing on my wall. That was my version of Anki at the time. I don't know if that ages me. Technically, Anki was out, but I wasn't using it at the time. And I similarly have the same regret that you do about not using that. And then Sketchy and Pathoma. I used a lot of Pathoma as well.
Oh,
and
yeah.
I would watch those videos endlessly. It looks like we do have a couple of chat questions, so I'll answer one. The first question, and I think this is a great question, most common mistakes in step one preparation. So, we didn't specifically put a slide in here, but I think Alina and I both would probably agree that the most common mistake that we see, I don't know, I don't want to speak for you, Alina, so I'll let you chime in too, but is you focus too much on what your friends are doing or what you hear other people are doing. And instead of staying focused on what you know is your learning style and what you need to do and get better at, it's really hard because it's very isolating to study for step one. You're usually by yourself. You're in this dedicated period. You're not going to class. You're not seeing your friends. Sometimes you're neglecting your health or not seeing your family. And so you have your blinders on, but if you hear a lot of noise outside, you can easily get distracted and start trying to switch up your whole study schedule on account of, you know, what your friend is doing or someone is telling you that they think works best. And so I would urge you to try to like close out all of that noise, put some headphones in and not listen to the ambient noise of what everyone else is doing. And just really take a few minutes at the beginning of your dedicated period to figure out and really sit down and think like, okay, what are my strengths? What are my weaknesses? How do I learn best? And make a schedule that reflects, you know, your strengths and appropriately gives you time to work on your weaknesses and uses the right resources for you. And that can look a little bit different for everybody, but ultimately, like UWorld or AMBOSS, one high yield question bank is going to be key to your success, and some sort of spaced repetition. But you don't need to watch Pathoma twice or 3 times to succeed. You don't need to read first aid 2 times cover to cover to succeed. So if you hear people talking about those things, try not to take it to heart too much and focus on, you know, the couple of resources that you find the most useful, and then challenge yourself to really get as much information as you can out of those resources.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with everything that Emily said. And then other things that students will do is compare themselves to their peers as well. Oh my gosh, but you know, they're only a week into studying and they're scoring better than me on the practice exams. Again, you know, that only causes more anxiety. It doesn't actually help you get better. So focus on being better than you were yesterday rather than, you know, being better than somebody else who's also studying. Some other mistakes that I commonly see, and I think Emily kind of echoed on this a little bit, is just trying to get through the resources and put a check mark on. And sometimes students will be like, okay, I need to get through Sketchy, I need to get through First Aid, I need to get through Pathoma, I need to get through UWorld twice, I need to get through, you know, Boards and Beyond. And really what happens at that point is students become, you know, they just go chasing check marks. I did this and I did that, rather than actually focusing on understanding and learning the material. So that's why we also say choose a few resources. You know, you don't need a lot. Choose a question bank, choose a couple other resources that work for you and use those. You don't a lot of the resources have all the same information, so it's really all about figuring out, okay, which way of the information presentation works best for my learning, rather than just trying to make it through all of them. So yeah, I think that's definitely one of another bigger mistakes that that people make.
Yeah, absolutely. One question we have in the Q&A is, do I need to do AMBOSS and UWorld, or is UWorld alone okay? What are your thoughts on that, Alina?
I think just UWorld and is enough. If you do all of UWorld and you see that you are, you know, still not passing your practice exams, I would lean towards redoing your incorrect questions on UWorld and really continue with the question bank that you're familiar with, rather than going through all of AMBOSS. And I know we also had kind of a similar question: how many passes of UWorld do we recommend? So this is really going to depend on how you're doing on practice exams, because if you only gotten through 50% of UWorld, but you've been passing all your practice exams, who am I to tell you, you know, you need to finish all of UWorld before you go take your exam, right? And I always tell students this. So if you have finished a full pass and you're still not doing your practice exams, again, my recommendation would be to redo the incorrect, rather than kind of redoing one whole full pass of it, and then see and assess where you are at that point.
Yeah, excellent. I definitely agree. And I think part of the passes of UWorld also depends on, as you guys may or may not know, UWorld has increased dramatically the number of questions in each question bank. Just every year, there just are more and more questions to get through. And so kind of the age, like when I was in medical school, we talked about doing UWorld twice, but that's back when we had less than 2,000 questions to do in one full pass of UWorld. And so I think with the addition of other questions, it becomes harder and harder to chase that goal in that checkbox. And so you have to be cognizant of, you know, how much time do you have and where you're at on your practice exams exactly. And I think, you know, if you want to do 2 passes of UWorld, you may need to do that starting, you know, during the year leading up to your dedicated period. And that's usually how I recommend students kind of get their feet wet with UWorld and start your preparation for step 1, you know, as you're going through your second year or second half of your kind of preclinical curriculum, so that you kind of get used to how to answer questions and approach them. And then, you know, you might get through it another 1.5 times in your dedicated potentially, or less, depending on, you know, how much time you have and how well you're doing.
There is a question. What was the last minute prep you would advise? What's advice on the last week of study? So this is going to vary by student, but I would tell you in the last week of studying, you should really focus on covering all those weaknesses. So look to see on your last couple of practice exams, what were the areas that you scored weaker in? And I would really hit those during studying, especially doing incorrect questions in those areas. So if you see, for example, you didn't do well in cardiology in the last 2 practice exams, I would really go through, you know, figure out, okay, what topics am I struggling with? And you can even quickly reference first aid and look through and see, okay, which topics in cardiology am I struggling with, so that you can really target that studying towards the topics you're struggling with. And then you can also work on the incorrects in UWorld on cardiology to do that. So you really want to maximize that time. You know, really all of your study time you should be spending studying things that you don't know. You know, maybe throw in 5% of studying stuff you know to keep your confidence right. But most of the time should be spent studying stuff you don't know, and especially on your last week of studying.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing I would add to that too is that in your last week of studying, when you sit down to take your USMLE exams, you're given a small whiteboard that you can use to write out things that you want to remind yourself of. For example, like Winter's formula for acid-base balance and those types of things. If you know that in the moment, if somebody shows you a question that you have to do some calculation, you're going to just completely like forget everything you've ever known about that. I always recommend that students sit down the week leading up to their exam and kind of practice writing out what sort of key piece of information or memory gimmicks you're going to use to remind you of things that you struggle to remember on test day. And so just take the time, and whether or not that's some biochemistry or something to that effect, like practice writing out whatever it is that is going to be useful to you on test day that you could write down, so that you can take some of that stress away when you sit down for your exam. Like, oh, I really hope they don't ask me this one question because I'm never going to remember how to do that. Just write it out, practice writing it out 10 times. And then first thing you do when you sit down for your exam, you write out kind of your cheat sheet on that whiteboard, so you have that to reference. And the other thing that I think can be really useful in the last week as well, I am a huge proponent of incorrect questions. I tell all my students, like, you're doing incorrect questions the last week leading up to your exam until they are all like out of that incorrect bucket and switched over to being correct questions. And at that point in time, incorrect questions really function more like a flashcard. They show up, you obviously like maybe remember the right answer because you've seen a question several times. But I tell all of my students, I don't want you to just select the right answer because you know it's the right answer. I want you to use it as an opportunity to test yourself and make sure that you can explain and articulate why the correct answer is the correct answer to this vignette and what makes the other answers wrong. And so to that effect, it ends up being a flashcard equivalent because you're really just testing yourself. But I think that's a really key and helpful way to kind of get through a bunch of questions quickly, but also really review concepts that you've gotten wrong and things that you've struggled with in a kind of high yield, very effective, very quick pace leading up to test day. And the last thing I think you can do as well is drive to your test center the week of your exam and just check it out, figure out where you're going to be sitting for your exam, make sure you know how to get there, and kind of make plans to that effect so that you aren't stressed the morning of getting to your test center. You know exactly where you're going.
Yeah, that's huge. Absolutely. You want to essentially minimize any sort of anxiety that you can possibly have during test day. So, make sure your lunch is ready, make sure your snacks are ready the day before, make sure your testing permit and your ID are packed in a bag, ready to go. Make sure your outfit is set, right? You want to wake up you know, eat your breakfast and, you know, drive to the exam. Or even better, if you have somebody to drive you, like I would get very anxious, especially on test days. So I had to like have my dad drive me so that I'm not like anxiously driving on the road. So really, the more kind of things that you can take care of the week and the day before, the more smooth your test day is going to be. And then you can really focus your energy on doing well in the exam rather than be worried about like all these external factors.
Definitely. One question that we got was any mandatory YouTube video or last minute podcast you would recommend? That's a good question. I don't have a podcast off the top of my head. For step 2, I always send people a list of videos to watch on biostats leading to the test day, just because I think the biostats concepts can be hard to remember. But from a step 1 perspective, I don't know, Alina, do you have any podcasts?
Yeah, for the videos, like, are you talking about like the Randy Neal biostats videos?
I think that might be his name.
Yeah, they're good. They're good for step 1 too, because they apply, you know, biostats is kind of very similar for step 1 and step 2. So if that is something you're struggling with, those are good. Overall, biostats, I think, is a great topic to really make sure that you refresh yourself on, like the week of your exam, or, you know, ideally before that, and then again the week of your exam. I would also write down kind of any high yield biostats formulas. And another thing that you can do is when you start your exam, you can actually write down those formulas on your whiteboard or your paper that they give you, because you know those questions are going to come up. So then when they come up, all you have to do is look at your nicely written formula instead of panic about it. So that's something that you can actually do. So I would, I kind of the week leading up to exam, I made like this sheet of formulas and maybe like some mnemonics and stuff that I wanted to write down right before exam. And I'm an anxious person, so of course I was looking over it, you know, in the morning of my exam, you know, went in there, wrote them down. And I think that was definitely really helpful. I still do this to this day for like every exam. So, you know, for the surgery and service exam, I do the same thing. Of course, they still test biostats, so that will never leave you. But yeah, so definitely, you know, the biostats videos. Besides that, I don't really know kind of any specific ones. Again, if there's any like sort of mnemonics that you like, I would look, you know, are there any like mnemonic videos or anything like that?
Definitely. Another question we got is after reviewing practice questions, sometimes the student takes notes but finds it's hard to have time to go back to review. What are our recommendations to help with retention of information? I think this is a great example of how you need to be really very intentional with what kind of notes you're taking when you're doing practice questions. And so what I mean by that is I tend to tell all my students, every question is a learning opportunity. You can learn from the correct question, the correct answer to the question. You can also learn from every single one of the wrong answer choices to that question and why those answer choices are incorrect. There's a lot of information in UWorld, as I'm sure you guys know, or any question bank therefore about like why, you know, one answer choice is going to be incorrect. But when you're jotting things down, it's important to realize that all of those other answer choices that are incorrect for one question, there's going to be a whole nother question that's dedicated to that specific concept that's popping up as an incorrect answer choice on the question that you're doing currently. And so you don't want to get bogged down too much. You should read through the incorrect question, their incorrect answers. I'm sorry, I keep moving back and forth between the wrong vocabulary, but you want to read the explanations to the incorrect answers. But I tell my students, like, you need to be jotting down a note or a flashcard rather. And that's what I would say. You should use Anki or use a written flashcard or use the flashcard system in UWorld to write down specifically something that you need to remember based on the educational objective at the end of each question. And so really focus on knowing the key point for that specific question, because all of the incorrect answer choice kind of data that's showing up will be tested in its own separate question. And that way you're not just writing down every single piece of data that's showing up in a question.
Yeah, absolutely agree with that. And, you know, when you're making that Anki card, really think about, because students really like putting nice big charts or diagrams or even pasting paragraphs from the question explanation. But when you're making your Anki card, you actually want to make it by hand, and it has to be something quick, right? These are quick cards. You want to, you know, read the question, answer the question, and move on, right? You don't want to be spending 20 minutes on one card. That's not what it's meant to do. So really ask yourself, what was it that I didn't know that made me miss this question? And that's exactly what you should be making your card about. It was that little, you know, maybe it was a little detail, maybe you didn't understand the pathophysiology. So that's what your card should be about, rather than trying to kind of put, okay, you know, here is like pathophysiology, here's the histo, here is the diagnosis, here is all this, right? That becomes a very, very busy card. And I would even recommend, if you need to, there were maybe a couple things or 3 things you didn't know, I would make separate cards for those rather than really trying to bulk them into one big card, because it's going to be so much more efficient for you to get through it, and it's going to be a card that's actually going to be useful to you.
Very well said. Nirav asks, what's the best actual exam day prep like? Like what kind of food and drink to take with you, how to relieve anxiety? I know we talked about this a little bit in terms of like take all of the decision making out of it, but any thoughts, food and drink? What do you tell your students, Alina?
Yeah, I would bring things that you like to eat. Yeah, I wouldn't really focus on, oh my gosh, this is gonna be the first day I start eating broccoli, right? No. You know, I would bring comfort food if anything, you know, if there's but also make sure there's not gonna be a fridge. So make sure it's something that could, you know, sit in a locker for a few hours and still be good. If there's a favorite sandwich that you like to make, you know, favorite granola bars, you know, fruit are always good to bring. So really I would bring what makes you happy, because there's very little happiness that you're going to have during that day. One happiness is going to be getting done with that exam, right? But during your exam, it's going to be nice to kind of just have something that makes you feel better and makes you feel good. So I would just, you know, bring what you love. If you're not a coffee drinker, this is not the day to bring a huge coffee. You know, same goes for like energy drinks. If you never drink those, that's not the day to start. So I would really keep your diet and keep drinking the way that you always have. You know, it's really not the time to experiment, but more so kind of have something that you're comfortable with.
Yeah, definitely. I think a PB, I mean, I always tell people a PB&J, if you like peanut butter and jelly, is a great option, or some sort of like
Oh yeah.
butter
Mm-hmm.
sandwich with banana, something that's going to keep you kind of full for a little bit, but not something so heavy that you're going to fall asleep immediately. And also, you know, on the same note of, you know, you don't have a fridge, other things that can be easy to eat are like a granola bar or something like that, that you can eat quickly, because you don't want to sit down and burn a ton of break time. You're going to be kind of anxious and have a lot of adrenaline
Mm-hmm.
for you. So things that you can take a couple bites of and leave in your locker and go back are great options as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's so true. Sometimes, you know, you're going to be so like, I'm personally one of those people, I'm so anxious during tests, I can't like have an actual meal. So like snacks or, you know, or granola bars and fruit were always like my go-tos. But really it's what you're most comfortable with.
Definitely. Another question we got is, do you think it is a must to review first aid, or is it possible to pass step one just going through UWorld? I think, you know, personally, I think you can pass step one just going through UWorld. I think all the information that you need is in UWorld. But first aid can be an excellent resource to refer back to. And if you're struggling to remember some things, they have great mnemonics in there, great tables and images that you can refer back to. And I think it's really serves as a good augment to what you're going to come across in your UWorld. Alina, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you there. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I don't think I would feel comfortable like saying you absolutely don't ever need to look at
Yeah.
first aid, but I don't think it's a book
No.
that you need to read cover to cover. And I think
Yeah.
people use it differently. And I tell
Mhm.
my students, you know, if you get a question wrong and you don't know something, go to that page in first aid and just kind of
Mhm.
skim it and see what comes up. And then, you know, use that to direct, you know, additional video reviews, right? Like we were talking about
Yeah.
before.
Yeah, exactly. Use it as a cross-reference and as a guide rather than using it, you know, this is what I need to, if I just memorize this, like I was saying before. So if you see kind of something listed under the topic in first aid, okay, this is probably like the high yield points that I need to know, but really you also should, you know, have an actual understanding of those things. It's very good, I think, for drugs, because for drugs, you can also even like quiz yourself with the first aid. You can cover, you know, you have your drug, they tell you the mechanism and the side effects. So you can cover those, you know, mechanism side effects and really quiz yourself and go through all the drugs. So say you're struggling with, you know, cardiology drugs. Okay, let me go through, you know, or like anatomic drugs. Let me go through and quiz myself on all of those. So I think it's also good to use kind of as a way to quiz yourself, because I think first aid it's very easy to cover sections up and try to recall them. And that's something that I use personally. And then in terms of diagrams, they do have a lot of really great diagrams in first aid. I won't lie. Sometimes I still go back to some anatomy things in first aid as a surgery resident. And it's crazy to think that like a surgical textbook doesn't have a better diagram, but sometimes that's the case. So really using it for the diagrams too. And, you know, for like the pathways for biochem, they have like a really nice page that integrates all the pathways. And again, you can use these pages to quiz yourself. Okay, can I draw out this pathway, you know, and then see if you're getting things wrong, see what parts you're missing. So I would really utilize it. I think first aid is a great resource. You know, I wouldn't utilize it as the only resource, but certainly very useful in a lot of regards.
Yeah, definitely. Well said. And then we got another question from Musa, who said, how many percentage score, what kind of percentage score on UWorld would you consider somebody to be ready for an exam? I think that's kind of a tricky question to answer, but I'll let you field it first.
Yeah, so I wouldn't use my UWorld percent correct to gauge if I'm ready for an exam. I would really use the practice exams. So NBME practice exams, UWorld practice exams, those are going to be your best predictor if you're ready. Remember that people are doing a question bank in many different ways. Some people are obviously redoing questions multiple times, right? Some people are doing it by topic. So that really skews the average. So the average may actually be higher, or it may be lower than what it would be for somebody doing questions for the very first time. Use first aid as a tool, use it as a tool to learn, but I wouldn't use your like overall UWorld percentage as a guide. However, I would use trends. So if you see that, you know, you're doing questions and progressively your scores are going up, you start at 40%, you know, 2 weeks later, you're getting 50%, right? I would use those trends as a guide of your improvement. So, okay, if I'm improving on these, let me take a practice exam and let me really see where I am. So that's the way that I would use it, but I don't have like a percentage that I could give you. Okay, you know, this percent would mean that you would pass.
Yeah, absolutely. Couldn't agree more. From another question that we got from Indrani was, from which resource should we practice the experimental or epidemiological type of questions? How do we recommend acing those bulky questions that take more time to understand? Those questions that are more like application of drug ads and things like that, I think is kind of where you're getting at. And I think the two resources that I tend to recommend for people, or three resources rather, one is going to be like, I think that this is a section that is really helpful in first aid in particular. Like I think the biochem section, similarly the drug section, pharmacology section, and then also the biostats and epidemiology section. I mean, I direct every single student I tutor from step 1 to step 2 to step 3 back to first aid for step 1 for the biostats and epidemiology section. So I think making sure that you have some familiarity and comfort with those formulas and things in that chapter can be really helpful. And then make sure that you're quizzing yourself on, you know, what's the difference between a cohort versus case control and those types of things, because that will come up. And then beyond that, if you're really struggling with those concepts, then the biostats kind of lecture series on YouTube can be really helpful. The Randy Neal lectures that we alluded to earlier, I think those can be really helpful to increase your understanding of the concepts and hopefully allow you to apply it better on questions. And then lastly, I would say just doing the UWorld questions. And if you need more practice, then I would say try using another question bank as well, to add into it, such as Amboss, to give you more repetition or, access to additional questions. Anything further that you'd recommend, Alina, or anything else on that?
No, I absolutely agree with that. That's yeah, and that really echo what Emily said. I direct my students to the biochem of or yeah, the biochem for first aid. Absolutely, especially that page I talked about that has all the pathways integrated. I think there is no better page in first aid. And yeah, absolutely for biostats. I mean, like I said, I still use it to this day to study for my surgical board exams, which have like 5% of biostats on them, but again, there are no better resources, so that's what I have to go back to.
Definitely. Lady asked, reviewing questions is difficult. Do we have any tips for how to be more efficient and less exhausting? Any thoughts?
Yeah, so it is going to be exhausting, and unfortunately, that's the nature of studying for step one. Know that everybody else studying for step one is experiencing that, so maybe they can give you a little bit of comfort. With that said, the first thing I would always recommend that students do is read that bottom line of the question. Because that will really guide you towards what is the point of this question, and what is the big concept that I should be getting from this. And that will really guide your review as you're going through it. And then you can start going through the actual question. I have students say that, they prefer reading the wrong, incorrect explanation first if they put like some incorrect answer. Whatever way you do it, that's that's helpful for you. If it works for you, that's the way you should do it. With that said, really as you're reviewing it, really focus on, okay, so now you read that bottom line, you know what was the point of the question. So really focus on understanding that concept as you read through the question, and don't get lost in kind of all the little details and all the kind of incorrect answer choices. Like Emily said before, you're going to be tested on those other incorrect answer choices at some point or another in the question bank. That's the beauty of doing UWorld fully and completely, is at one point or another, probably at multiple times, you're going to be tested on all of the high yield information that's going to come up on exam. And if you didn't really kind of fully understand that concept, that one of the incorrect answers, well, you're going to see it in a different question. So really focus on getting to that point of the question. If it's a question that you read through, you absolutely know, you can go through the explanation really much quicker for that. You don't have to kind of sit there and read every single word and ponder upon it. So that would be a way to really maximize kind of your study time, really focusing your time on those questions you didn't know, you weren't sure about, and spend less time reviewing those questions that you got right, that you knew.
Yeah, definitely. And I think the other thing to think about is early on, you want to see the fruits of your labor, right? Like we all want to see that the time that we're putting in is helping us get better. And I think one way to do that early on is by doing questions on tutor mode, because it gives you immediate feedback on, yes, you're right, or no, you're wrong. And then, what can be really annoying sometimes, I think, for students is if you're doing all your question sets on timed mode initially in your study period, you keep getting the same question wrong and wrong and wrong, right? Like you do a question block and maybe you get 2 questions on cardiology related topics and you realize you got both of them wrong. And you're like, wow, that sucks. I'm bad at cardiology. But alternatively, if you did the whole block on tutor mode and you went through and you got it wrong once, then it gives you an opportunity 10 questions later, if you get a similar question, to apply what you learned question you just did and get the next question right as a result. And that actually strengthens your learning and helps you to build those connections and really solidify those connections amongst the material. And so one way I think you can be more efficient early on is by doing questions on tutor mode and focusing kind of on the key things that Alina mentioned. So focus on that educational objective and then focus on reading explanations for the answer choice you chose if it was wrong, and any other answer choice if you were like down to 3 answer choices and you ultimately picked answer choice D, then read the other 2 explanations as well for the answer choices you were considering, and kind of limit yourself in that way, so that you can keep moving through the questions. I think on average, I usually tell people, your 40 question block, if you're doing it on tutor mode, should take you probably about 4 hours to get through, in terms of reading each question. And sometimes, you can get through it a little bit faster, but you want to make sure you're gleaning all the information out of the questions that you can, because again, UWorld is a learning resource. It's not just an assessment tool.
Yep, absolutely.
Okay. And then I think other questions we got, and this might be our last question because we're running out of time, but in general, how can we decrease anxiety on test day? I think we alluded to this a little bit, but I'll hand it over.
Yeah, so there is overall, you want during your study period, you want to be, if you are somebody who experiences a lot of anxiety, especially with test taking, and you know what, let's face it, that's every single med student, right? We all kind of have it to an extent. We all experience anxiety. One thing I always tell my students who really struggle, if you know test day comes and on test day you're very anxious, really remind yourself of every success that you've ever had before. And you could even start making a list, you know, okay, well, I passed these last 2 practice exams, right? That's a, you know, really remind yourself of all the positives. You're in medical school, right? You've come this far. You've made that achievement. You know, you passed these practice exams. You passed your first and second year, right? You got into medical school, and really remind yourself that you're perfectly capable of this, right? Looking at these other achievements, you know, you really have to kind of go into this like logical perspective, because the emotional side is okay. I mean, I'm anxious, right? But the logic and the reality and the truth of everything is you are capable of doing this, because you have had these accomplishments before, right? Your previous accomplishments are representative of your future success. So really think about that and remind yourself, you know, there's breathing exercises too. You can look on YouTube. I'm a huge person. I like listening to Huberman Lab podcast. I don't know if anyone does that, but they do talk about like, you know, anxiety and learning and just like a lot of like neuro kind of, but like applicable neuro, like how to like better your memory and stuff like that. So I'm really into that sort of stuff. So if that's something you really you really kind of want to take charge of, having every technique in the book to not be anxious, you can check that out. You can look at YouTube videos with like different breathing exercises that you can do on test day. And I would practice those. So I would, you know, I would practice those during your practice exams. Maybe there's a breathing exercise that helps you, you know, do it during your practice exam, and then you can do it during your test. But overall, the more you study and the more confident you become in your knowledge, your anxiety will get better because you will have all that proof. Okay, I've studied, I've done all of this, right? The amount of hard work that you've put into it, know that and remind yourself of that if you need to.
Excellent. I think that was like a perfect way to end. Couldn't have said it better myself. Well, thank you guys so much for joining our webinar tonight. Just as a reminder, I know we put this in the chat as well, but here are the links to our other pages. So you can set up a free consultation if you're interested in tutoring services or just what we have to offer. That's the web page there at contact. And then check out the webinars. Again, we have another webinar coming up for COMLEX and how to succeed on COMLEX level 1. And then lastly, feel free to email us any other questions that you have. I'm sorry, I think we got to most questions tonight, but it was really awesome having you guys all here, and best of luck to all of you in your studying for your Step 1 exams.
Yeah, thank you guys for coming. It was a real pleasure. I enjoyed answering all your questions. And yeah, please reach out to us if you're interested in tutoring or if you do have more questions. And we will be present on more of these sorts of webinars in the future. So keep checking the page for any updated info on the future webinars.